I've lost track of how many times I've tried recording this video, so what I'm going to do is go through it as quickly as I can, and then if you've got any questions, I'll answer them in the comments rather than trying to cover everything all at once within the video. So, extensive versus intensive. What does it mean? How does it apply to training? And more importantly, how does it set you up for success, particularly if you've had a significant period of time away from the gym like most people have? So, extensive versus intensive. Extensive essentially refers to developing a base, foundation, and covering a large variety of different movements, covering different fitness components, basically working towards being an athlete, okay? And then intensive is specialization, so it's about turning your training into something that is a little bit more targeted towards one specific goal. Literally, every periodization model across the board or any goal that you will ever work towards follows this kind of system or this philosophy of training. So this would be your off season if you're an athlete, this would be your in season or building up towards a comp, okay? So nice and easy. Extensive, essentially, I know it's confusing because of the word intensive, but extensive, you can reword it as intent, okay? And intensive, again, I know it's really confusing, it's kind of easy to remember though in a weird way. Expression, so they're like the opposite almost. Intent, it means that there's a purpose behind everything that you do. So whether or not it is, you know, the positioning that you'll do on the deadlift, or whether it is, I don't know, like activating certain muscles within a given movement, the mind-muscle connection, all that stuff, making sure, you know, working towards developing range of motion within a given exercise, that occurs within this extensive block, okay? The intensive block, there is still an emphasis on that, in the same way there's an emphasis on intensity and everything here. With this intensive block, it's more about expressing everything that you've built within this stage. So again, it might be within the deadlift, you know, there is a competitive element to it, or you're working towards a max. You should have done enough work within this extensive block, okay, to create a certain degree of autonomy so that when you come into the intensive block, it's not on your mind. Because we know when we look at the research that cognitive function within an exercise, so the demand that's placed on you cognitively, will directly influence your output and will actually increase things like fatigue rate, decrease like force output, everything like that. So you want to basically build up a range within the extensive side of things to be able to express everything that you built up. Now, why is this so important? Why does it tie in particularly more recently with now that we know that the gyms are reopening, and why I wanted to make sure I got this video done? Detraining, I am working through all the research at the moment. We've found that, and most people are aware anyway, but it's just to validate it from a scientific standpoint as well as the anecdotal work. Things like tendon stiffness and muscle mass, they're the first things to drop off, okay? And unfortunately, your neurological, well, fortunately and unfortunately, your neurological capacity, okay, so if you've trained in a way to work towards maximal strength, intensive work, which would be within the strength realm, focused more on the neurological side of things, less on the muscle mass, okay? If you focused on that, your neurological benefits actually stay for a very, very long period of time. There's some research to show that you can go through a period of detraining for over 30 weeks, okay, and not lose the neurological benefits, even in older adults. So people that are exposed to sarcopenia, dynapenia, all these different factors that are to do with age, their neurological benefits from strength still stay, okay? However, muscle mass, tendon stiffness, and fatigue resistance, which is a huge, huge aspect, things like glycolytic capacity within a muscle, they all diminish after about 2 months. Now, obviously this lockdown's been going on for a prolonged period of time, and there are several other factors that go into this, whether or not it's your physical activity level, your training level prior to going into the lockdown, but either way, the muscle mass, the tendons, and the fatigue resistance, they're all the things that influence your ability to tolerate load, okay? Not the ability to lift it. So your neurological system, and this is why if you look at some of the detraining research, you can see that strength doesn't necessarily change, but recovery rates do. Just because you can lift something, yeah, doesn't mean your body can handle it very well. So that's just something that you need to bear in mind, that because you've had to take this time away, okay, your body will have naturally detrained unless you were timing your leucine ingestion to the minute, sleeping and getting in a huge amount of physical activity, okay, you may have lost some of these other benefits. Where does tendon stiffness, muscle mass, and fatigue resistance lie? On the extensive side, yeah? It's not something that is immediately gratifying or that is directly related to maximal strength, but it forms the base of the pyramid that can work you towards being over here. Most people are only interested in the intensive side of things. So if we use an example between the two, okay? So an intensive example would be your deadlift 1RM, okay? It's something that's specific, it's something that a lot of people within the strength will focus on, and it is intensive because it's focused on what you can express within that given period of training. An extensive version, okay, might be your 5RM within a deficit, I don't know, just to go really whole hog with it, within a deficit stiff leg deadlift. Okay, so you can still, this is one thing that we'll touch on in a moment later on, you can still actually ramp the intensity up here. So even though the word intense is in there, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't push hard on this side of things. It's just how specialised you become within that range of training. Within this side of things, okay, you're intentionally putting in, I talk about it all the time, things like mechanical demand factors. You can adjust them to keep the level of specialisation and kind of the peak. You can stop yourself from working too hard by simply introducing exercise obligations, which is something that I've touched on before when it comes to returning to the gym, and one of the things you have to be aware of. So the difference between the two, okay, the reason why it's so important particularly now is most people are only interested in the intensive stuff. So most people go through their entire training career. Let's table strength for a second. Let's talk about body composition, okay? Most people, the intensive side of things with body composition would be losing the fat, okay? So ramping up the calorie expenditure, decreasing the calorie intake, focusing on, this form of exercise increases metabolism by 48%, so we need to do that, okay? However, from an extensive side, the extensive, let's just, again, if we, so here it would be, let's use the all too famous acronym, HIT training. And then over here, okay, it would be something as simple as just nutritional habits. Okay, so conditioning yourself and taking the time to work on developing good solid nutritional habits tends to take place within the extensive side of things because it's more of a general overview, okay? Yes, you can talk about making really specific habits and go into the nitty-gritty of it all, but by and large, if you handle things like your sleep, you handle your protein intake, okay, and you handle a general understanding of what calories in versus calories out means, that's going to form the vast majority of your results. But people dive to this intensive block and try and get ultra specific straight away. Okay, so the difference between the two, how much time should we spend in each? Well, to be brutally honest with you, okay, people will disagree or will have their own opinions. But in terms of the clients that I've worked with, my own training, experimenting over the years, I genuinely think that 80% of your training, it's Pareto's law, the 80-20 rule, 80% of your training should be spent within an extensive block. It should be focused on developing a vast array of qualities and then using an intensive block selectively to be able to express that. Off-season competition, okay? Qualifiers, even then, you could actually go into a qualifier for a competition and not be ultra specific. Nationals, something like that, okay? Depends on you as an individual, but it's about understanding the difference between the two, the particular things like intent versus expression and so on. So what are the problems that people come across and why do people always gravitate towards this? This is one of the reasons, isn't it? It's gratification, okay? Most people, when you're in an intensive block, we know that we've talked about goal setting, we talk about things like the SMART principle and, you've got to have these little things in the bank. And when we talk about external versus internal motivation, okay, you'll find that internally motivated people, they don't need this gratification as much. So you will find when you watch these internally motivated people, these people that seem to excel at everything that they do, particularly in the world of training, they don't have a problem with this extensive stuff. They can form that connection within their minds and think that, I know that a glute ham raise is going to work on more solid base of muscle mass to work with when we come towards being intensive within the deadlift. So they will naturally just take care of this and they don't need this gratification. Most people, however, they bring themselves towards this intensive side of training because they want to know that everything is working. And they avoid this extensive side because of a couple of different reasons. Number one, the variability is really high. Now, as I've said to people before, the data that you record is only as useful as your understanding behind it, which is the reason why Fitbits and all these different fitness trackers are great, but a lot of people don't even understand what they mean. Okay, so all these different data trackers and anything that you record, you have to understand the rationale behind it. It's not to say that one measurement is better than the other, it's all about your belief and your association that you have with that metric. So if you're in this block and you have fixated your entire focus of motivation on your deadlift 1RM, you're always going to gravitate towards this intensive side of things. There's a couple of different things that you can do here, okay? With the extensive stuff, like I said, the main problem is there's a lack, the lack of gratification and the fact that there's a lot of variability. We know that that's a problem. Although it tends to keep people motivated in the short term, it doesn't really for a lot of people in the form of tracking progress unless you do this little thing to fix it. How do we make sure that you go towards the extensive block? So we're working on things like building muscle mass, and we're working on things like movement awareness. All you do is you, first of all, sounds so incredibly obvious, you measure things, okay? Like I've just said then, the validity of a measurement isn't as important as the reliability, because you can measure whatever you want, okay? I have gone through training blocks where, like, for example, when I had to rehab my ACL, after I had that reconstructed about 4 years ago now, I went through a training block where I tracked the number of bodyweight squats that I could do within 60 seconds. Because ultimately, let's just, now that we've got this there, so we know that we need to measure things, yeah? And that you can peak, or do like mini peaks with varied exercises, so that you feel like you're building momentum towards different movements. So say, for example, you come back in and you know, right, well, I want exertion, like I spoke about in a video that I put out a while ago. We know full well, I could sit here and say all day that be safe, don't lift heavy, but you're going to do it anyway, so it's completely irrelevant. You know, and that's one thing, I've read everything that I can get my hands on when it comes to this returning to the gym like, and I am working on a program at the moment that will be ready in time for people to be able to utilise when they get back into training. But I know full well that people are just going to want to lift heavy anyway, so it's going to be difficult to kind of reel that back in. So what you do is you control for mechanical demand factors, increase them, that will reduce the overall load that is lifted, which in the realm of strength is the most intensive block you can do, okay? Another thing that I just want to write underneath here, just to give a better association for a lot of people. It's varied, but it's still working towards a goal. A good example that I've used, if you imagine working on a dartboard, okay, and your goal is to just hit the dartboard. Yeah, that's all that matters. When you're in an intensive block, that dartboard is tiny, okay, it's really, really small, but when you hit it, you get 1,000 million points, whatever you want to say, okay? Within the extensive block, you're still working towards the dartboard is just bigger. And you might get less point, they might be smaller, okay, but as long as you hit the dartboard, it doesn't matter. So you're still working towards loads of different qualities. It's still the same goal in mind. It's just, like I said, that focal point is just a little bit broader. So overall, we would look at adjusting mechanical demand factors. So like we've said before, there is a couple of my favourites. I won't list them all, but time and attention. Increasing the time and attention of a movement, okay, it keeps you within the extensive block. It stops you from gravitating towards lifting as heavy as possible. If you don't believe me, okay, what I want you to do with this exercise, when you go back into the gym, or even before that, even with the limited equipment you've got at home, just start with one weight, just the same weight and one movement. Just pick a movement, okay? So I typically like to use deadlift just because it's my favourite exercise, but you can use the overhead press, you can use a bent over row, whatever you want to do. Take that same weight, okay, 20 kilos, 60 kilos, 100 kilos, I don't care how strong you are, just take that same weight and just do a normal intensive rep. Again, intensive is the ultimate end goal, the focal point of your entire existence within the world of training. For most people that are listening to this, it'll be strength. It will be maximal strength, so that would be your deadlift 1RM. So within that realm, okay, the most intensive factor would be the load that is lifted. So what do we need to do? Take a set weight, increase the time and attention. So do a normal deadlift and then do 5 seconds on the way down and go straight into the next rep. Guarantee that weight feels heavier than it does if you execute it normally from an intensive standpoint and you just focus on expressing your strength. Another way you could do it is increase the range of motion. So like I said a moment ago, the deficit stiff leg deadlift, if you increase the range of motion of a movement, that's going to drastically decrease the amount of weight that you can lift. So again, it keeps you in the extensive side of things. You can still push yourself as hard as you possibly want. You can still ramp up the RPE and everything like that and the overall exertion, but it will keep you away from working towards this intensive focus. Another example that we can use is the complexity of the movement. So it's becoming increasingly popular in the world of training at the minute, for example within the squat, utilising a one-on-one quarter squat or a myotatic squat, whatever you want to call it, where you squat all the way down, come back up a quarter of the way, back down again, back up again, okay? That's just increasing the complexity of the movement, increasing the time and attention. Overall, it changes contractile speed, which is another one as well. That will again reduce the amount of weight that you can lift. So you can ramp up and work as hard as you possibly want, but it prevents you from gravitating over towards here. So I hope that makes sense. As always, if you've got any questions, just leave them in the comments below. If you've got any questions about the whole return, then please just don't hesitate to give me a shout.